My name is Matthew Orr. I am the owner and founder of VoIPTools and chief architect. We're going to talk about Recording Manager today, and I think the first thing we should kind of do is kind of talk a little bit about why Recording Manager exists and how it can help you. So let's start with some of the areas where we can enhance the recording capabilities of 3CX. And one of those things, one of the challenges that you have with 3CX is getting access to recordings. Really, there's only two ways that you can do that. Go through the 3CX management console, or if you have the capability turned on, you can access it through your 3CX phone client. But we provide a web-based browser application that logs you in and gives you access to those recordings so that you no longer have to give people access to the 3CX management console to get access to those recordings. We also have security levels, granular access to those recordings. So if you're a system admin, I will have certain rights within Recording Manager. If I'm a manager, I'll have different rights, and as end user, yet more restricted rights to access things. So we give you some control over who can do what. Because it's a web application, you can access it from anywhere. But we also have another feature that is useful, and that is that we convert the recordings as archives to MP3 files, and then you can forward those MP3 files as attachments to emails. And that's important because there's some applications that can't deal with WAV files. So having them in MP3 has some advantages. What else? Because we have a retention policy, both for the original recording and for archives, we help you manage your hard disk space. So we'll take those recordings and we'll compress them down to about 1/4 of their original size. We'll convert them to an MP3, and then so that means that the recordings take less space on disk. But then we also have two separate retention policies. One retention policy for the original recording and another retention policy for archives, so that you can say keep your original recordings for 2 weeks on the 3CX server and then delete them off the 3CX server and keep your archived version of the recording for 3 years or whatever you choose, right? So we'll talk a little bit and I'll show you how to set up archives and retention policies. The other thing is that it's pretty common in large organizations to need to keep track of who's doing what. This was actually a requirement of a large bank in Singapore, where they had quite a number of branches of this bank, and they needed to know who was getting into 3CX and what conversations they were listening to, and if they had permissions to download a recording or to attach it to an email. They needed to know who was doing what. So we'll show you our archive, our audit trail feature. Monitoring quality is another thing. So we provide the ability for you to give scores to agents on how they handled calls, add notes to those recordings, and do some of those kinds of things. So I hope you see as we go through these that we're adding a lot of capability in terms of managing and handling recordings that isn't built into 3CX. One of the other things is that managing who is having their calls recorded and who is not at all straightforward to see in 3CX. You basically have to go into the 3CX management console and then select users and then find the extension that you're interested in and then go to the options tab and check that checkbox. Wow, a lot of work just to find out whether or not they're having their calls recorded. So I'll show you how we make that process a lot easier. And we also give you the ability to set which extensions have their calls transcribed as well. And so we'll talk a little bit about recording transcriptions. We also provide the ability for third-party analysis of recordings. So you can send your recordings to a third party. They'll look at those recordings for sensitive words. So if you have proprietary information that you don't want discussed outside of your organization, you can have these people check for keywords and make sure that people aren't talking to other people outside of your business about things that they're not supposed to. And they also provide a service of critiquing how your salespeople are handling the sales process, and they can give you advice on how you can do that a little bit better. So let's talk a little bit about what do you do when you install Recording Manager for the first time and you've been using 3CX for a year or two or more. We provide a fairly sophisticated importing tool that allows you to import those existing recordings and get them into Recording Manager. And then finally, this is kind of a crazy thing, but some call centers don't allow their agents to make outbound telephone calls directly. And so they want to restrict their ability to make calls to only doing it by clicking on a button, say a button in a CRM or something like that. And the way that they restrict the agent's ability to make telephone calls unless they're doing it through the approved way is by adding secret digits to the telephone number that's being dialed and then using outbound rules that require those secret digits. The problem is that when you are dealing with recordings, those recording files have the telephone number that was dialed embedded into the recording file itself. And it also displays on our browser window what telephone number is dialed. So we can go through and strip those secret digits from any place that's visible so that people can't figure out what that secret digit, what those secret digits are and start making unapproved telephone calls. So we'll show you some of those things. So that's kind of a highlight of what we're going to be talking about today. So let's just jump right into the demo portion of our tool. So here we are. As you can see, it's a web-based application. And as I mentioned, you log in with your extension and voicemail PIN. And when I press enter, it's going to go out to 3CX and it's going to authenticate those credentials. And then it's going to look at my rights within 3CX. Am I 3CX admin? If so, I'm going to be able to do certain things. If I'm a extension group manager, then I'm going to be able to see my recordings, but I'm also going to see those recordings made by the people that I manage. I won't be able to see recordings made by the CEO or by the HR department, just those people that I manage within 3CX. And when I look at this screen, I can see that I can see multiple extensions here. So that's a clue that I've logged in as somebody with manager rights because I can see my own recordings, but I can also see recordings made by those people that I manage. And this is important if, for example, you want to do some quality checks. You know, I've got staff that work 24 hours a day, 365 days a year here at VoIPTools. So I can't listen in to all of these conversations unless I want to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning. So this makes it simple for me to listen to a recording and kind of see what people are doing. So that's what this row here is the original recordings. So right within this browser, without any additional tools, I can listen to that recording. Did somebody have a question? I do have a question. Are the recordings stored in the SQL database or in a flat file structure? That's a good question. So the recordings, the original recordings, continue to reside on the 3CX server. If you are archiving, those recordings will be moved to a different location on your hard disk, and they are saved as MP3 files. And then a link to those files are saved um, in the database itself. So it keeps the database small and high performance, but still get you access to all the information you need. So hopefully that answers your question. So you can play that recording, you can scrub around within. So you can see here, I can email this recording, I can download the recording. What's this little green checkbox here though? So the way that Recording Manager works is that it sees that a new call is going on and that it's being recorded, and it monitors that telephone call. We can't do anything with that recording while the telephone call is still going on because 3CX is actively writing to that file on disk. But as soon as that call's disconnected, the lock gets freed up on the recording file itself. We detect that that file is now available, and we instantly grab that file, convert it to an MP3, compress it down to 1/4 of its size, and if archive, this is if archive is turned on, make a copy of that and save it in the archive location, and that all happens instantaneously. So scenario is that one of your Q agents is working with a customer and gets kind of annoyed at the customer and cusses them out and hangs them up. Well, what's that agent going to do? His first thought is, oh, shoot. If my boss hears what I just did with that customer, I'm going to get fired. So what's he going to do? He's going to try and delete that recording. So if he has rights to the 3CX management console, he's going to go in there and try and delete the recording. If he has the ability to manage his recordings through his 3CX client application, he's going to try and delete it there. So it's really important that we grab that recording the second the call is over and do all of this processing and get it saved so that they can't delete it. And we do this all within milliseconds of the telephone call being disconnected. So this happens in real time. And one of the things that we do, going back to this little green checkbox, is that we take a hash of that recording. And if anybody tampers with that recording, then it will no longer match the hash. And as a result, this green checkbox would turn into a red X. And now you know somebody's been trying to tinker with this recording. Okay? So going back to the example where the employee cussed out a customer, the customer calls back and says, I want to talk to a manager, gets the manager on the phone, says, yeah, I was talking to your agent and he just cussed me out and hung up. And I would say something like, oh, wow, I'm really sorry to hear that. What was your telephone number? And you can see this one here starts with 248. So I can just type in 248 and it'll go through and it'll find all of the telephone calls for 248. And then what was the extension number? Who was it that you were talking to? You were talking to Mohit? Okay, so I'll put in 1051. And now I have got down to that precise telephone call, and now I can listen to that recording, right, by clicking on this icon. Now, if I had archive turned on, you would see another identical icon here in the archive column here on the far right. And of course, I could listen to that archive version as well. But I wanted to show you what I could do then here. Okay, so I've listened to the recording. I've got some things that I need to keep track of. Hey, Jim, I'm really sorry that you were having to deal with that very unpleasant customer. And frankly, the rudeness of that customer, I would have probably hung up on him too. So don't sweat it. Everything's okay. So I might want to save a note like that. I'd have a transcription of that recording if I have recording transcriptions turned on for this extension. And then you see a list of questions that I can ask. Now, this is just some test questions that some of my testing staff have used in here. But typical questions might be things like, was the agent courteous? Were they knowledgeable? Were they able to answer all of their questions with one telephone call? Whatever you think is important for managing how that evaluating how that agent had handled the call. So let's give him a 7 out of 9, a 7 out of 10, and an 8 out of 10, and a 9 out of 10, and 8 out of 10 for these. And then save it. And what you'll notice up here is that now there's a score, right? And so when I close this up, and we'll get rid of this filter, and now I can see just by looking at it that this call has been evaluated. So if you have a QA team that needs to evaluate every 5th telephone call or something like that, they can easily see which ones have notes and scores associated with it. Does that make sense? Another thing that you'll notice is this little red X down here. And you see a series of checkboxes. This is a feature that you can turn on or turn off based on who is logged into the system. So normally I would recommend that you set the settings for Recording Manager that nobody can delete recordings, period. If you do that, then all of these checkboxes go away and this little red checkbox goes away. So that the only way that you can delete recordings is through the retention policy. And I think conceptually, I think that's the right way to run this so that people aren't going in and trying to hide their tracks. Anybody have any questions at this point?
One question which has been answered, that are the recordings stored in the SQL database or in a flat file structure?
Yep, and we talked about that one already. By the way, for those of you who don't know Mohit, he is our manager of the support team. Our support team is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So it doesn't matter what country you're in or what time zone you're in, you're always going to be able to get somebody to help you either through phone, live chat, email, or remote session. So you should be able to get help all the time. All right, so I digress. We do have staff in Hyderabad, India, Delhi, India, and multiple states here in the United States. And so when they make telephone calls, they want to see these recordings based on their time zone. So if they're looking for a call on a certain date and time, I want to see it based on my time zone because I'm the one that placed the call. So this allows you to manipulate the date and times that show up for these recordings. Okay, so that's the main screen. Of course, anything that you display on the screen here or on any of these pages, you can export in various formats. So if you want to create your own custom reports, the data is all there. We also give you access to the SQL server. So if you want to go direct to the database and query the database there, that's an option for you as well. Now, we had a banking group in Singapore that was mandated by law that they have an audit trail of anybody that's interacting with their recordings. So we provided the ability for them to log everything that you do. So when did the person log in? When did they log out? What did they do while they're in there? Did they listen to a recording, download a recording, email a recording, try and delete a recording, which of course they can't do if you turn off that feature. So this is a full audit trail of what people are doing while they're in there. And then there's some other settings. Remember I told you that you have now easy access to see whose calls are being recorded and whose aren't? Here you go. Here's a list of extensions, and you can see by the checkbox who's having their calls recorded and who isn't. It's that simple to change. Want to make it even simpler? I want everybody's calls recorded. There you go. Now everybody's calls are recorded. Oh, yeah, but we probably shouldn't record human resources and we shouldn't record the CEOs because he might be talking about special stuff. That's how easy it is to control whose calls are being recorded and whose aren't. The same is true of transcribing recordings. So if I only want to transcribe certain extensions, there you go. That's how it's done. It's that simple. All right. The other thing I should mention is that we can transcribe the whole recording, whereas 3CX only does about the first minute or so. We can transcribe the whole recording. So that's what that's all about. It's going to balk at me because I didn't save those changes, but I'm now moving over to those questions. Remember I said that there'd be some questions that you can score agents on if I enable that question. Then now this question will show up on that list when you're doing quality assurance stuff. So you create the questions that you want to score your agents on. All right, so that's what that setting is all about. And the last one is site settings. Again, it's complaining because I didn't save the changes before I tried to navigate away. If you don't like our colors and you want them to look like your company colors, you can come in here and you can do that. You can change the colors to something that works better for you. If you want to browse to your company logo, you can add the company logo to it. And then once it's been uploaded, you can select it here. You can change the header name. So let's put in VoIPTools here. And press apply. You see right now it says 3CX Recording Manager. Now when I press apply, it says VoIPTools Recording Manager, and you could add your icon, your logo up here and change the colors. And now when I go over to the browser, you see that the colors have changed to whatever you want to have the colors. So this is the typical user interface that you use with managing recordings. The whole idea was to make this ultra simple to find the recordings, listen to the recordings, manage those recordings, and have those recordings managed automatically. But there's more settings that we've made a little bit more difficult to get to on purpose because we don't want people going around and changing some of these settings. So in addition to this web interface, oh, I got another question. I am full admin, but I only see my team on the recording manager, recording options, selections. I think in the latest version of Recording Manager, that's been changed so that system admins can see all of the recordings for the whole company. I'll show you that setting because this is a brand new setting. So let me show that to you. So I'm going to hide this screen and I'm going to go back to those settings that you can't get to through the web interface because these are a little more critical and a little less often used, and we don't want people doing this very often. This is the import tool. I should have started this with it hidden there. So basically, all I have to do is click the import button and it will go to 3CX and say, give me a list of all of your recordings. And it'll grab those recordings, add them to Recording Manager. If there's an archive policy, it'll take those original recordings and archive them as well. But there are some circumstances where you might want to manipulate how and what recordings are imported in, so we have the ability to specify a date range if you only want to import a certain date range. You can specify the 3CX version here because 3CX used different formats for the recordings for version 12 versus version 14. So it really only applies to phone systems that have been around since version 12. But this gives you some additional capabilities to manage how those recordings are imported in. But remember, you had the question about, hey, how come I can only see some recordings? Well, here's rights that you set for the ability to download recordings, email recordings, delete recordings, log. Who can see that audit trail log, and who can manipulate whose calls are being recorded. And you can specify nobody can download recordings, or group managers can or do it, or everyone can, or only system admins. And this is a new feature. I don't even think this feature of the system admin's been released to the public yet. So so that's what it do. One of the things you could do in the short term is you could set yourself as a manager of the default group, and as long as everybody's in the default group, then you'd be able to see all of their recordings. So that might be a shortcut way to get to what you were wanting. So this is where you set the rights for who can do what. This is where you turn on or turn off transcriptions, but again, it's also further refined by who has a checkbox next to their extension as to whether or not their recordings are going to be transcribed. Voice to text transcription is done by Google, so you do have to set up a Google account, and this is where you put in your key and that kind of authentication information to Google. Be aware that Google has a fairly generous free tier, but depending on the number of recordings that you transcribe, you could run into a point where there's a cost associated doing those transcriptions. So that's what this is all about here. Okay, Recording Mover. This is a third-party tool. We talked a little bit about this, where they can monitor for anybody saying something they're not supposed to say outside of the building, or providing guidance on how salesmen can be more effective. So it's a third-party company that can evaluate your recordings, and you can choose through this interface, do you want to send those recordings up to them in real time, or do you want to do it once a day at midnight to save on your internet bandwidth? Do you want to send them inbound calls only, or outbound calls, or specific queue calls, or specific extensions? That's this controls which calls get sent up to the third-party company for doing those evaluations. Of course, if you're going to send emails of recordings with the recording as an attachment, you have to have access to an SMTP server. So this is where you would put in your Google credentials, for example, for an SMTP server. This is where you set the retention policy. I'm going to take that one off. So if you want to set a retention policy, you click on this checkbox, set the number of days, and what time of day it's going to run that retention policy. And it'll go through and it'll find all of the recordings that are older than 365 days, and it'll delete them. 3CX has a retention policy as well, but we take it one step further. If you turn on archiving, then when the retention policy for the original recording runs, it's going to first check to confirm that there's an archive of that recording before it deletes the original recording. And if the archive is missing, then it will archive that recording and make sure that you have a copy of that recording before it goes and deletes the original. And then these other checkboxes affect whether or not you want to delete the records out of the database after you've deleted the recording or not. By default, I would think you would want to, but different people want different things. This one, the customer wanted to email a copy of all of their recordings to a central exchange email box and then delete the original recording off the 3CX server because he had a hosted 3CX server. Let me be more precise. They had a 3CX server that was hosted in the cloud, not by 3CX. and it had a minimum hard drive space, so he wanted to get those files off the 3CX server right away. So as soon as that call was finished, we archived the recording, and then we deleted the original recording and removed it from the database. So that's what that's all about. This archive policy also, so you might want to put 5 years in here. So I don't know, 600 days or something. I don't know what 5 years is, 365 times 5, I guess. So separate archive policies. So you might want to keep your original recordings on the 3CX server for a brief period of time so that people can get to it through the 3CX management console or through their 3CX phone client. But for the most part, people, if they don't need the recording after, I don't know, 2 weeks or 3 months, whatever's appropriate for your company, let's get it off that 3CX server so we're minimizing the hard disk requirements for that hosted 3CX server and get it over to the archives. And then after 5 years, I don't need that recording at all, neither the original nor the archive, so we'll delete the archive as well. So that's what this screen is all about. This portal tab allows you to set some defaults for display purposes in the web browser application that I showed you. So you can set a default time zone. So if you don't select the time zone as an individual person, this is the time zone that it's going to show all of the dates and times for those recordings. This is handy if, for example, you're hosting your 3CX server on a server that is not in the same time zone that you reside in, and you want the dates and times to be reflective of your actual time zone. So that's what this is about. And then the display culture is largely to affect how dates are displayed. So if you're in the UK, for example, it's going to be day, month, year. If you're in the United States, it's going to be month, day, year. So setting the default culture is going to affect how those dates are displayed. And then I told you, you can choose how you want to authenticate to the application. You can use your voicemail PIN or your web password or even the phone password. If you have a physical phone, you can use different passwords. And these have varying degrees of security, right? So if you're ultra security conscious, you might want to use the phone password, for example. But if you're not that worried about it, you can just use the voicemail PIN. Then, of course, if you click on this button, it'll take you directly to the web application. Here's an interesting one. Let's say you're a call center and you don't want your employees to make direct telephone calls to the outside world. Instead, you want to restrict who they can call based on, say, a CRM or something like that. So you create a button in your CRM. When they click on that button, it initiates a telephone call, and you can do that using our REST API. And so you surreptitiously add some additional digits to that telephone number. And then you have an outbound rule that says if it's an outbound call from this extension, the telephone number must start with this secret set of digits. Otherwise, it's going to reject the call. That way, if they have a good friend in Hyderabad, India, he can't just pick up the phone and chit chat with his buddy in India for 3 hours. The only way he can make that telephone call is through the CRM. The problem here is that the way 3CX names their recordings is that they put the telephone number that was dialed in the file name itself, and it will include those secret digits. So if you download a recording or you attach it as an attachment to an email, it's going to have that secret information in there. And you don't want them to be able to see that. So by specifying the secret digits, it will then, recording manager will then strip that data from the recordings when you download it or email it or see it on the screen. It'll hide that information so that they don't get access to those secret digits. So that's what that's all about. And then, of course, license and the about screen. So that, in a nutshell, is Recording Manager. We've got a lot of feedback that lots of people have used our tool. We have customers that have 6, 8, 10, 12 million recordings, and they're still able to go into Recording Manager and find the recordings that they want. Try and do that in the 3CX Management Console, and you'll find real quickly that the console will time out, and you won't. Once you get to a very large number of recordings, you can't access them anymore through the console because it just times out. So we don't have that problem with Recording Manager. So granular access, easy to add notes, easy to score how agents are handling calls, easy to provide granular restriction to who has access to what information, easy to manage whose calls are being recorded or transcribed. These are all features that we add in addition to the really wonderful recording features that are built into 3CX. So with that, before we finish up, any additional questions? Will it run on MySQL? Some of our applications have been written to work with MySQL. Exporter is an example. Power Dialer will work with MySQL or SQL Server. Recording Manager, as of today, works with Microsoft SQL Server. You can use the free Express edition. It's not likely you're going to hit the maximum database size because we're really not saving that much data other than from, to, date, and time, and a link to the recording. Although I guess we do have the notes and the transcriptions. But always open to other alternatives. One of the things that you'll learn that's unique about VoIPTools, you're talking to the owner of VoIPTools, the lead architect, and I'm in a position where I can make those kinds of decisions. And so we can talk about any kind of enhancement or change that you want and look at how that would affect our existing customers and future customers. And I see no reason why we couldn't do this in MySQL as well as SQL Server. Just have to figure out how to pay for it. But yeah, no, I'm not opposed to it. That's why Power Dialer and Exporter both use MySQLs, because customers came and said, hey, we really want to do this with MySQL rather than SQL Server. And I have no particular preference other than the time that would be required to make those kinds of changes. But yeah, certainly open to it. If you see another feature as well, feel free to let us know. You're still trying to find out max concurrent calls. Well, that's a little bit different than what we would do with Recording Manager. When 3CX announced the early release of the alpha release of version 18, they said that they were going to have a new report that showed max concurrent calls. And I have to admit that I haven't followed through to see if that report ever actually made it into production. But it was certainly something on 3CX's radar. We had a tool called Call Counter, and its purpose was to kind of keep track of what was your max simultaneous calls over time. What we discovered was that 3CX is inconsistent in how they allocate what is a simultaneous call. And because they don't make public the algorithms that they use, we found that people were regularly complaining that our numbers didn't match what 3CX was showing on the main 3CX management console. I can give you an example. When you do a barge, that is another telephone call. So for example, if you have 3 employees all talking together in a 3-way conference call, you would think that's 3 simultaneous calls, which it is, unless one of those people barged into the telephone call. So you still have 3 people on the telephone call, but the barge, for whatever reason, doesn't count as a simultaneous call against your license. So it's weird things like that that 3CX does that isn't documented anywhere. And we finally got to the point where there was just too many complaints. Well, how come your count doesn't match what 3CX counts? And so we discontinued the product. To be honest with you, we discontinued it when 3CX said that they were going to provide a report. And so we said, well, if 3CX is going to provide the report and we get a lot of flack over our numbers not matching the 3CX numbers, better to just let the product go. So, I should probably follow up and see if 3CX ever did release that report. Because if they didn't, well, then maybe something is better than nothing, and we could make that product available again. The other there's a couple of different ways that we could do it. We could also periodically query 3CX and say how many simultaneous calls now, how many simultaneous calls now, how many simultaneous calls now. And that wouldn't be too onerous of overhead to do that if we did it once a second. I suppose a simultaneous call could get in there between those 1 second queries so that for 1 second you had an additional simultaneous call. But that might be another way that we could do it where we don't have to do the calculation for simultaneous calls and we just depend on 3CX. But it's not a calculation that they make accessible through the 3CX call control, which is how our applications work. I want to thank you for giving us some of your day today. We very much appreciate the fact that you've given your valuable time to us.